Okay, so we're going to continue talking about the seedless vascular plants. Plants that have a vascular system but still do not produce seeds. Call them spores. So we talked about the lycophytes or the club mosses in the last one. Let's take a look at this big group we call the pterophytes. This often includes the ferns, and they say ferns and their relatives or allies. Basically, ferns, horsetails, and then the whisk ferns, which kind of a weird group. Not true fern, but another category. Um, so the relatedness is still in a state of flux. It's uncertain how all these guys are all related. Some of the key things, though, that we see across the pterophytes is that they will form antheridian archegonia. So they have those male and female reproductive structures, and they use water for the sperm, the flagellated sperm, to swim to the egg. Okay, so kind of the general characteristics of the larger group of pterophytes. Within pterophytes, we're going to see unique traits or traits that are unique to each of the specific groups. So the first group to mention and tackle within pterophytes are the whisk ferns. These guys are primarily found in the tropics. We don't often see them in the Midwest. We can grow them, greenhouses, nurseries, etc., but we tend not to see them naturally found in the Midwest. They, again, tend to be more of a tropical type of plant. Oh. All right. So what we're going to see with these guys is whisk ferns have a forking stem that runs photosynthesis. So what we're looking at here or over here, these green stems, that's the plant. That's the part of the plant that's running photosynthesis. So it's going to have the chlorophyll, chloroplast with chlorophyll within the stem. They don't have what we would consider true roots or leaves. So again, all photosynthesis has to be coming out of that stem-like structure. They will often have a symbiotic with fungi in order to obtain increased levels of nutrients. So the fungi can capture more nutrients, give the plant nutrients, plant gives the fungi sugars, etc. So hopefully beneficial. The part of the plant you're seeing above ground is a sporophyte. The gametophyte will be located below ground during the time of the life cycle where the gametophyte is present. So it'll grow, develop underground, and then merge up, develop up out of the soil, and then that's the sporophyte. So, like I said, weird kind of group. If anybody is familiar with a thing called a whisk broom, those brooms with the strands on the top of them that look like straw, that's where this generic name came from when we call them whisk ferns. Flip it upside down, it kind of looks like a whisk broom. Okay, so again, not that diverse in the Midwest, primarily a tropical species. Now, here's one that is all over the Midwest. Anybody who lives near a body of water, lake, stream, creek, pond, you're probably going to have come across horsetails. So horsetails evolved around, show up or evolved around 300 million years ago. Difference is they were the size of trees. These things were massive, 100, 150 feet tall. Huge, huge plants 300 million years ago. The major evolutionary change, they just got smaller. They're still out there. They're still fairly similar to what they looked like back 300 million years ago, except a lot smaller. When we look at them, they also have a photosynthetic stem. Oh, gotta spell it right. Photosynthetic stem. This spike coming off the side, this little whorl of spikes, those are actually the leaves of the horsetails. So it looks more like a reed. Not a reed though, different type of plant. When we look at them, what we'll notice is you got this, let me get the pen, this section here, and then you have this little cluster here, and then this other section here, this little cluster here. So the circles are what we call the internodes, and then you have the node here, and then an internode is a circle, and then the node. Coming off the internodes, you have these little leaves that branch off. Leaves do have some photosynthetic ability, but they're just not real, they're not big, they're not providing excuse me, a lot of surface area for photosynthesis. Let's see. Other things to mention, the strobili is where they're going to produce their spores. So that is this yellow structure here. This is the head that forms when it's time for reproduction, and it will pack all those little segments with spores. Here's the micro view. So this thing right here is the equivalent to one of these little kind of sections right there. And inside of it, all those little black dots, those are all the spores of the horsetail. So huge reproductive potential. Lots and lots of spores are possibly being produced here. And then typically when it gets dry, the spores get released. That tends to be a characteristic we see with reproduction, with lots of different plants. Release your offspring when it's dry, then the offspring get to the new environment, and then when the moisture comes, germination occurs. So that little cone, or that strobili or strobilus, sits at the top of the stem. Generically, we call these guys scouring rushes. They have silica in their stems. They're going to be crunchy. They're going to be hard. They're going to have this, it almost feels like rough sandpaper-like stems. Early pioneers would use these to help clean their dishes. So they would take horsetails, break them up, and kind of wipe the inside of a pot or a pan, scour it like a Brillo pad or a washcloth, hence the name scouring rushes. They've been around long enough that these guys are also part of the coal deposits. So 300 million years, they were able to grow. They were massive. And then as these plants died, they, over 300 million years, have formed into coal. So another plant that we are using today as we burn fossil fuels. Okay, so those are the horsetails. On to the ferns. Now, ferns. Ferns are the most abundant group of seedless vascular plants. So what we see with the ferns, get some bullets. All right, most abundant group of seedless vascular plants. Ferns have a large range. They're found for the most part globally. They've been around 350 million years ago. Huge geographic distribution. Again, a lot of biodiversity. Most of the larger biodiversity is found in the tropics. So we see a lot more down in tropical regions, environments than temperate, but we still do have them here. Sporophyte is dominant. That's what we're looking at here, this green thing. That is a sporophyte. Gametophyte is limited. The sporophyte is also going to be independent of the gametophyte. So remember back with the mosses, your sporophyte was attached to the gametophyte. Not so with ferns. Completely opposite. Flip that logic around. These guys will also have a vascular system. They will have roots, stems, and leaves. So they have a lot of these features of the vascular plants. So let me zoom back just briefly. So we talked about the evolutionary steps. All of these characteristics evolved here, and then you come over here and go, okay, euphylls or leaves also evolved and are found in the ferns and their allies, while they're not found here in the lycophylls. When it comes to leaves, yeah, these guys have big broad fronds, big broad leaves. The typical fern frond comes out, and then you have this, and then you have all these little, we call them pinnae, that are attached to each of these leaves, or blades if we want to call it that. Okay, so these are the little pinnae right there. And then you take this and go, well, there's a blade, B for blade. And then if you had another blade over here, you had another blade over here. Collectively, all of this equals the fern frond. Okay, so lots of surface area. That's a huge feature. Lots and lots of surface area for the fern. So it increases photosynthetic ability. So pretty important structure there. All right, so general life cycle. Let's talk about this for a minute. Here's a gametophyte. Let's start there. The fern gametophyte. It germinates, grows. It's going to have these little rhizoids, root-like structures. Rhizoids are not true roots. They're going to help absorb some nutrients and some minerals, but not what we would classify as a fully true root structure. The gametophyte then develops, looks like this little heart-shaped structure, and on the gametophyte, you're going to have an archegonium and an antheridium forming. Now remember, archegonium, this is your female structure. This is where your egg is going to be housed. Antheridia is your male structure, and that's where your sperm are going to be produced. The sperm then swim, so remember flagellated sperm using water, swim over, meet up with the egg to fertilize the egg. Now that's going to be on the gametophyte where fertilization is going to take place. Fertilization, you get a zygote. The zygote will start to grow and develop and physically grow out of the body of the gametophyte. So this thing starts growing up. That is your sporophyte, that new structure growing up from the gametophyte. So there's your antheridia, your archegonia. Archegonia tend to always be in the crease of the heart, and again, if fertilization occurs, now we get a sporophyte structure growing up and out of that. And I'll show you what they look like as they grow up. There's a thing called a fiddlehead. That's the sporophyte, early sporophyte structure that will be growing up. And then that develops into the frond. On the underneath of the frond, the fern will start to produce these sporangium. That is where you're going to find your spore production occurring. So sorus is just a collection or cluster of sporangia. The sporangia or sporangium is a structure that actually houses the spores. Those get released when it's hot and dry. Again, dry is the key for the release of spores and seeds and things like that. So things to mention about this little life cycle and diagram. So the gametophyte lacks vascular tissue. It is going to develop from the spores. So again, this just grows and develops, and it will produce produces the archegonia and antheridia. Once the antheridia has released the sperm, it swam to the archegonia, or the egg in the archegonia. Fertilization occurs, then the sporophyte will develop. Sporophyte's going to be pretty independent of the gametophyte. It will quickly establish the rhizoids and develop that support system. So if the gametophyte gets damaged or destroyed, the sporophyte is still functional. But then we'll also notice that as the sporophyte matures, again, it goes into reproduction and produces those sorus or sporangium and makes more spores. But what we'll also see is this structure known as a rhizome. This is an underground stem structure. So the rhizome is actually a form of asexual reproduction within the ferns. So the rhizome is this little, it looks like a stick underground with all these little hairy roots or rhizoids coming off of it. And you can take a chunk of the rhizome, plant it, and it will actually develop sporophytes. They will grow out of the rhizome asexually. Sexual reproduction is antheridia and archegonia. So when the new sporophyte is developing, it comes up as a thing known as a fiddlehead. Oh, let me get that. So let's go back to our rhizome underground. So in the spring, you got this, looks like a stick underground with all these little hair structures, rhizoids coming off of it. And then early spring, this little coiled up structure here called fiddlehead emerges. And then the fiddlehead slowly uncoils, and as it uncoils, it spreads out into the fern frond. So every spring, if you guys have ferns around your house, every spring you can watch this progression and this developmental process. If it's in the fall, the fronds are all going to be dried up. They have dropped their spores if they reproduced sexually, and the frond is going to die off. dead, die off, rot away, and you're left with the rhizoid still underground. Next spring, more fiddleheads will emerge and then uncoil, and you can see fern fronds again. So 2 methods of reproduction, sexual and asexual. So let me red star this. Here's a list of structures I want you to be comfortable with associated with the ferns, the gametophyte, sporophyte, rhizome, fiddlehead, sporangium, rhizoid, archegonia, and antheridia. What are those structures? Can you identify those structures? And what do those structures do? Okay. All right. Last thing to leave off with. Ferns, they've been around long enough to also be part of the fossil fuel we use today. So you think about back in geological history, there is a window of time called the coniferous period, roughly about 295 million years ago to about 360 million years ago. These 3 groups, ferns, club mosses, and the horsetails, all evolved during that time period. They all became part of coal and fossil fuel formation because they've been dead and buried underground for 300 plus million years. This is why we call fossil fuels a non-renewable source of energy, because we are not making more of these things. So, okay, so that takes care of all of the seedless plants. Nobody in this lecture makes a seed. These plants all produce through spores. Some of them are vascular, some of them are non-vascular. So what we will do when we get into the next group of plants, we're going to go evolutionarily, we're going to go into that next group, we will get into the plants that are producing seeds. And we'll talk about the gymnosperms, and then lastly, the angiosperms. The plants we have on Earth today, the dominant plant group, the angiosperms, have been around the least amount of time, but they are evolutionarily more successful than any other group of plants out there. They've literally outcompeted lots of other plant groups to be the dominant plant group on Earth today. All right, so that's it for this lecture. Check out the other plant material, and then we'll talk about gymnosperms and angiosperms in another lecture.